If my husband ever came home smiling after ignoring my calls all night, my grandmother used to say, it meant one of two things. He was bringing wonderful news, or he was hiding something that would change your life forever. I never understood those words until the night Daniel walked through our front door at exactly 12:03 m.m., loosened his tie, flashed the warm smile I had fallen in love with 28 years earlier, and said, "Naomi, you won't believe this." I looked at him for a long moment before forcing a smile of my own. By then I already knew that whatever came out of his mouth next would not be the truth. The grandfather clock in our living room had just finished chiming midnight when I heard his truck pull into the driveway. Outside, a light rain tapped softly against the windows of our two-story home in suburban Ohio. The porch light cast long shadows across the wet pavement, making everything outside look strangely peaceful. Inside, nothing felt peaceful anymore. My coffee had gone cold hours earlier. My dinner sat untouched beneath a sheet of aluminum foil on the kitchen counter. My phone rested beside my hand with 23 unanswered calls displayed across the screen. 23. I had counted them twice because somehow that number mattered. It represented every excuse I had made for him throughout the evening. Maybe his phone battery died. Maybe he was stuck in traffic after the interstate accident I had heard about on the evening news. Maybe he had forgotten to charge his phone. Maybe there was a last-minute meeting at the engineering firm. Every possibility had sounded reasonable until another hour slipped away. Then another. By 10 o'clock, concern had quietly replaced patience. By 11, concern had become something colder, heavier, harder to explain. Daniel had never been the kind of man who disappeared without saying a word. Even during business trips he would text before boarding a plane or call from the hotel, just to tell me good night. That simple habit had become part of our marriage, one of those little rituals couples stop noticing until it suddenly disappears. Tonight it disappeared completely. I had called his coworkers. No answer. I had called the office. Closed. I even checked the weather, convincing myself perhaps a storm had delayed him somewhere. But outside the sky remained calm, almost beautiful beneath the moonlight. At 11:37 p.m. I almost dialed the local police department. My finger hovered over the number before I slowly lowered the phone again. Something inside me whispered to wait just a little longer. It was not hope. It was instinct. There is a difference, and women learn it with age. Hope comforts you. Instinct quietly prepares you for pain. Then I heard the familiar rumble of his truck. Relief rushed through me first, so quickly that it almost made me laugh. Seconds later it disappeared just as fast. Daniel stepped inside carrying no briefcase, no laptop, no look of exhaustion. His white dress shirt was neatly pressed, his hair carefully combed back despite the rain, and there was a brightness in his eyes that did not belong to someone who had worked late into the night. He looked refreshed. Happy even. He hung his jacket on the hallway hook as casually as if he had returned from buying milk around the corner instead of vanishing for nearly 8 hours without a single message. "Naomi," he said cheerfully, "you won't believe this." I studied his face without speaking. His smile never wavered. Somewhere deep inside me, something small and quiet shifted into place like the final piece of a puzzle I had not realized I was assembling for months. I smiled back just enough to hide what I was thinking. "You're right," I answered softly. "I probably won't." I stood there watching him while he talked with the same easy confidence that had once made me feel safe. He explained that one of his coworkers had experienced an unexpected family emergency. Everyone had stayed late to help reorganize an important project, and in all the confusion his phone battery had supposedly died. He even laughed softly while apologizing, promising that he had not realized how worried I must have been. Years ago I would have believed every word without hesitation. That night I simply nodded, warmed his dinner, and listened without interrupting. He thanked me for understanding, kissed the top of my head, and carried his plate into the dining room. If anyone had walked into our house at that moment, they would have seen an ordinary married couple ending a long day together. They would never have guessed that something invisible had changed between us forever. After Daniel went upstairs, I remained in the kitchen for several minutes, staring at the rain sliding down the window above the sink. My reflection looked different somehow. Not older. Not sadder. Just quieter. There comes a point in a long marriage when silence begins to speak louder than words. I finally understood that. The next morning began exactly like hundreds of mornings before it. The coffee maker started brewing at 6:30. The local news played softly in the background. Daniel came downstairs wearing a navy blue polo shirt instead of his usual dress shirt because it was Friday. He smiled, complimented my pancakes, and asked whether I had remembered to water the flowers near the front porch. Every sentence sounded perfectly ordinary, almost rehearsed. Yet I noticed something I would have ignored a year earlier. His cell phone never left his hand. When he stepped outside to collect the newspaper, it went with him. When he poured himself more coffee, the phone rested face down beside his mug. Even when he walked into the laundry room for less than a minute, he slipped it into his pocket. It was such a small habit that it almost seemed foolish to notice, but once I did, I could not stop seeing it. 6 months earlier, things had been different. Daniel used to leave his phone charging in the kitchen overnight. Sometimes I answered text messages from our daughter while he was mowing the lawn because he trusted me completely. We laughed about forgetting passwords together. We shared calendars, grocery lists, birthdays, and reminders. Somewhere along the way, without any announcement, privacy had quietly become secrecy. At first I blamed technology, then I blamed work. Later I blamed myself. Maybe I had become too predictable after 28 years of marriage. Maybe retirement planning had placed pressure on both of us. Maybe every couple experienced seasons of distance. Those explanations comforted me because they required nothing except patience. Looking back, I realized they also required me to ignore what was directly in front of me. Little things began disappearing one after another. Our evening walks around the neighborhood became rare because Daniel was always tired. Weekend breakfasts turned into rushed cups of coffee before he claimed he needed to stop by the office. He laughed less. He listened less. Sometimes I would finish telling a story only to realize he had not heard a single word. When I asked whether everything was all right, his answer never changed. He would smile gently, squeeze my hand, and say, "You worry too much, Naomi." I wanted to believe him because trusting the person you love is easier than questioning everything you have built together. As Daniel backed his truck out of the driveway that Friday morning, he rolled down the window and waved exactly as he always had. I waved back until he disappeared around the corner. Then I closed the front door, leaned against it, and allowed myself to admit one quiet truth that I had avoided for months. My heart was no longer afraid of what I might discover. It was afraid that I already knew enough. Over the following week I stopped asking questions because I realized questions only produce polished answers. Instead, I started paying attention to the moments between Daniel's words. Those quiet spaces revealed far more than his explanations ever did. On Monday evening he arrived home carrying a bakery box from the little shop across town. He smiled as he placed it on the kitchen counter, and said he had wanted to surprise me with my favorite apple pie. It was a thoughtful gesture, the kind that once would have erased every doubt from my mind. Yet as he washed his hands, his phone vibrated twice. He glanced at the screen so quickly that most people would not have noticed, but I did. His smile faded for less than a second before returning exactly as it had been. He slipped the phone back into his pocket without reading the message in front of me. That tiny movement stayed with me much longer than the pie. On Wednesday I suggested we have dinner at our favorite family restaurant, the same place where we celebrated anniversaries and birthdays for nearly 3 decades. Daniel hesitated before saying he had promised his supervisor that he would finish a proposal that evening. He apologized sincerely and promised we would go the following weekend instead. I smiled and told him work came first. The words sounded supportive, but they tasted unfamiliar. As soon as he left, I opened the kitchen calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. 4 years it had been filled with birthday reminders, doctor appointments, and weekend plans written in different colored ink. Recently the calendar had become strangely empty. Not because our lives were quieter, but because Daniel had stopped sharing his schedule with me altogether. Friday afternoon I drove to the grocery store to pick up a few things for the weekend. As I walked through the produce section, I noticed a display of fresh lilies. They reminded me of the bouquet Daniel used to bring home every spring simply because he knew they made the house feel brighter. I stood there longer than I expected, remembering how naturally those small acts of kindness had once come to him. Relationships rarely change overnight. They shift one ordinary day at a time until one morning you realize you have been living beside a different person without noticing exactly when the change began. Later that evening, Daniel returned home carrying a dry cleaning bag over one arm. While he changed upstairs, I gathered the empty hangers from the closet. One jacket caught my attention because it carried a faint fragrance I did not recognize. It was elegant and subtle, nothing overwhelming, yet it was unmistakably different from the laundry detergent we had used for years. I held the sleeve for only a moment before hanging it back exactly where I had found it. I refused to let my imagination race ahead of the facts. Suspicion without evidence can destroy a marriage just as surely as dishonesty can. Still, I could no longer ignore the growing collection of little inconsistencies. None of them proved anything by themselves. Together they formed a picture that was becoming harder to dismiss. That night, after Daniel had fallen asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling while the quiet hum of the air conditioner filled the room. I made a promise to myself that felt both frightening and strangely comforting. I would stop searching for reassuring explanations. From that moment forward, I would simply follow the truth wherever it decided to lead me. Saturday arrived with bright sunshine and clear skies, the kind of beautiful spring morning that usually pulled neighbors into their front yards to mow lawns or wash their cars. I watched Daniel drink his coffee while scrolling through his phone, smiling at something on the screen before quickly locking it as soon as he noticed me looking in his direction. He told me he needed to stop by the office for only a couple of hours to review budget numbers before Monday. I wished him a productive morning and handed him a travel mug filled with fresh coffee. He thanked me with the same gentle voice I had known for decades, kissed my forehead and drove away. I waited exactly 15 minutes before picking up my purse and car keys. I was not chasing him. At least that was what I kept telling myself as I backed out of our driveway. I simply wanted to see whether his actions matched his words. The engineering office was less than 20 minutes away. I parked across the street beside a small public park where families often gathered on weekends. From there I had a clear view of the building entrance. The parking lot looked almost empty. Only 3 vehicles sat near the front doors, and Daniel's truck was not one of them. I remained in my car, watching the entrance for nearly 40 minutes. No employees arrived. No lights turned on inside. Eventually a maintenance worker unlocked a side gate, but the office itself remained closed. I looked at the dashboard clock, then at the silent building, and felt the last trace of my comfortable explanations quietly disappear. I drove home by a different route, trying to convince myself there could still be a reasonable answer. Perhaps he had gone to another company location. Perhaps there had been a last-minute change. Those possibilities sounded weaker now than they ever had before. When I reached our neighborhood, I noticed Mrs. Henderson trimming the hedges in front of her house. She waved me over with the friendly smile she had worn ever since she and her husband moved in 8 years earlier. We chatted about the weather, her grandchildren, and the community garden that volunteers were planning for the summer. Then she paused for a moment before saying something that made my stomach tighten. "I almost stopped by yesterday afternoon," she said. "I thought Daniel was entertaining visitors because I saw a woman waiting outside your house for several minutes. She left before anyone answered the door." I forced a pleasant smile and asked what the woman looked like. Mrs. Henderson apologized immediately, explaining that she had only noticed shoulder-length brown hair and a light blue jacket before driving away to run errands. She assumed it was someone from Daniel's office. I thanked her for mentioning it and wished her a wonderful weekend. Inside the house I placed my purse on the kitchen table and stood quietly in the stillness that had once felt comforting. There was no proof of anything. Only another unanswered question added to a growing collection of unanswered questions. That afternoon Daniel returned home carrying a folder filled with printed papers. He looked relaxed and cheerful as he placed the folder on the dining room table, mentioning that the meeting had gone well. I nodded while pouring iced tea into 2 glasses. As we sat together in the fading afternoon light, I realized I was no longer listening to the details of his story. Instead, I was watching how naturally the story flowed, how smoothly every sentence connected to the next, and how easily he met my eyes while saying things that I now knew could not all be true. For the first time since our marriage began, I understood that the hardest part was not discovering a secret. It was realizing how long someone you loved had been practicing the art of hiding it. Monday morning felt strangely ordinary, And that was exactly what unsettled me. The dishwasher hummed quietly in the kitchen while sunlight filtered through the dining room curtains, painting familiar patterns across the hardwood floor. Everything inside our home looked exactly the way it had for years, yet I no longer trusted the comfort of familiar things. After Daniel left for work, I carried my coffee into the small home office we shared whenever we paid bills or organized household paperwork. I was not searching for something dramatic. I simply wanted to understand whether my growing doubts were rooted in reality or fear. I opened the filing cabinet where we kept bank statements, insurance policies, and tax records. Daniel had always insisted that we should both know where everything was stored because, as he often said, marriage meant sharing responsibilities. Those words echoed in my mind as I sorted through neatly labeled folders. At first, everything appeared perfectly normal. Utility bills were paid on time. Mortgage statements matched our budget. Retirement contributions continued as planned. Then I noticed something unusual. 3 monthly credit card statements were missing from the folder. That had never happened before. Daniel was meticulous about paperwork. He kept receipts from hardware stores, grocery trips, and even routine oil changes. Missing statements were completely out of character. I logged into our online banking account using the password we had shared for years. Most transactions looked familiar until I reached several charges that immediately caught my attention. They were small enough that many people would have ignored them. A lunch at a cafe across town. A flower shop I had never visited. A boutique hotel listed only as a pending authorization. None of the amounts were extraordinary, yet none of them fit our usual routine either. I wrote each date and location on a yellow legal pad without drawing any conclusions. Facts first. Assumptions later. That simple rule became my anchor. By Wednesday afternoon, another unexpected piece quietly fell into place. I stopped at the neighborhood pharmacy to refill a prescription and ran into Melissa Carter, a woman who had worked as Daniel's administrative assistant several years earlier before accepting a position with another company. We greeted each other warmly and spent several minutes talking about retirement plans, rising grocery prices, and the unusually warm spring weather. As our conversation ended, she smiled politely and said, "Please tell Daniel I hope he enjoys all those consulting projects. I have seen him downtown a few times lately, and he always looks like he is rushing to another meeting." Her comment sounded innocent, but it lingered in my thoughts all afternoon. Daniel had repeatedly told me he rarely visited downtown anymore because most of his clients now met virtually. Someone was mistaken. Either Melissa had confused him with another man, or Daniel had quietly changed his routine without mentioning it. When Daniel arrived home that evening, he seemed relaxed, asking about my day while helping set the dinner table. I watched him laugh at a story on television, refill my glass of iced tea before I asked, and compliment the homemade chicken soup exactly as he always had. That was what made everything so difficult. He was not acting like a stranger. He was acting like the husband I had loved for nearly 3 decades. Yet beneath every ordinary moment, another reality was slowly revealing itself, one careful detail at a time. I no longer felt driven by jealousy or anger. Those emotions had quietly given way to something steadier. I wanted the truth, whatever it happened to be, and I had finally learned that the truth rarely announces itself all at once. More often, it arrives like morning light, slowly illuminating what had been standing in front of you the entire time. The following Friday, I decided that waiting for chance to reveal the truth was no longer enough. I did not want to accuse Daniel. I did not want to invade his privacy without reason. I simply wanted answers that matched the questions quietly collecting inside my mind. After breakfast, I drove downtown, carrying nothing more than a notebook, my reading glasses, and the list of dates I had copied from our bank statements. The first stop was the little cafe where several of the credit card charges had appeared. It was a comfortable corner place with brick walls, fresh flowers on every table, and large windows overlooking the sidewalk. I ordered a cup of coffee and chose a seat near the front window. For almost an hour I watched people come and go while pretending to read a magazine. Nothing unusual happened. I was beginning to think I had made a mistake when I saw a familiar truck pull into a parking space across the street. Daniel stepped out, checked his watch, and looked around before walking toward the cafe. My heart pounded so loudly that I could barely hear the soft music playing overhead. Before he reached the entrance, a woman approached from the opposite direction. She appeared to be around my age, with shoulder-length brown hair and a light gray sweater. They greeted each other warmly, but not in the way I had feared. There was no embrace, no secretive behavior, no attempt to hide. They simply smiled, shook hands, and sat together near the back of the cafe. I remained where I was, far enough away that they could not see me reflected in the window. Their conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. They reviewed papers spread across the table, pointed at notes, and occasionally laughed about something written in a folder. When they finally stood to leave, the woman handed Daniel a thick envelope before walking toward a nearby office building without looking back. Daniel remained outside for a moment, placed the envelope carefully inside his leather briefcase, and drove away. I stayed in my chair, feeling more confused than relieved. That meeting had not looked romantic. It had looked purposeful. Yet why had he hidden it from me? Why invent stories about working late instead of simply telling me where he had been? Those questions followed me home like quiet passengers. 2 days later, another unexpected answer arrived without warning. I was organizing old family photographs when the telephone rang. The caller introduced herself as Rebecca Collins. Her name meant nothing to me until she explained that she was the woman from the cafe. She apologized for contacting me unexpectedly, and said she had found my number through public records after realizing something was terribly wrong. My fingers tightened around the phone as she spoke. Rebecca explained that she was a financial consultant specializing in retirement planning. Daniel had hired her nearly 7 months earlier, because he wanted professional advice before making what he repeatedly described as the biggest surprise of his life. According to Rebecca, every meeting had focused on protecting our long-term finances, while arranging something that he insisted had to remain completely confidential until the paperwork was finished. She paused before adding one sentence that left me completely silent. "Mrs. Foster, I do not know what Daniel has told you recently, but after our last meeting I became concerned. He suddenly stopped following the original plan, and some of his recent requests no longer matched the reasons he gave me at the beginning. That is why I felt you deserved to know that something has changed, even if I do not yet understand why." After my conversation with Rebecca, I did not confront Daniel. That surprised even me. A week earlier I would have demanded answers the moment he walked through the front door. Now I understood that incomplete information only created incomplete conclusions. Rebecca had not accused him of anything. She had simply confirmed that the story I had been hearing at home was not the same story she had been told in her office. Somewhere between those two versions, the truth was waiting. That evening Daniel came home carrying a small paper bag from the bakery again. He smiled when he saw me arranging fresh flowers in the dining room, and asked whether I wanted dessert after dinner. His voice sounded warm, familiar, almost comforting. I smiled back just as naturally as he did. If he expected me to question his schedule or mention another late meeting, he gave no sign of it. We ate together, talked about our daughter, discussed the neighbor's new fence, and even laughed at an old family memory from a summer vacation in Michigan. Anyone watching us would have believed nothing had changed. Yet everything had. I had stopped measuring his words. I had started measuring his actions instead. During the following days I quietly organized our financial records into separate folders, updating account numbers, insurance documents, retirement statements, and property records. It was something I had postponed for years because Daniel always handled most of those details. Now I wanted to understand every page for myself. Knowledge brought an unexpected sense of calm. The more I understood about our finances, the less frightened I became of whatever might be coming. Rebecca called again on Thursday afternoon. She explained that Daniel had canceled another meeting without offering a clear reason. Before ending the call, she hesitated and then mentioned one final detail. Months earlier Daniel had spoken repeatedly about creating complete financial security for both of us before retirement. Recently, however, he had begun requesting revisions that delayed important paperwork while refusing to explain why. She told me she could not discuss confidential documents, but she felt uncomfortable watching someone abandon a thoughtful plan without any clear explanation. After hanging up, I stood quietly by the living room window as children rode bicycles along our street. Life outside continued exactly as it always had. It reminded me that personal storms are often invisible to everyone else. Friday evening Daniel announced that he would need to attend another late meeting the following Tuesday. His explanation sounded polished and effortless. I simply nodded, asked whether he wanted chicken or salmon for dinner before he left, and continued folding laundry. He looked almost relieved by my lack of questions. For a brief moment I wondered whether silence can sometimes be more unsettling than an argument. That night, while he slept peacefully beside me, I reached for the notebook I had been keeping inside my nightstand. I read through every date, every receipt, every observation, and every conversation from the past several weeks. Looking at those pages together, I realized I was no longer searching for evidence that Daniel had betrayed me. I was searching for the reason he believed he had to hide so much from the person who had stood beside him for 28 years. Whatever answer waited ahead, I knew one thing with complete certainty. I would not meet it with panic, anger, or accusations. I would meet it prepared with clear eyes, a steady voice, and the quiet confidence that only the truth can give. Tuesday arrived with the same quiet routine that had become strangely comforting. Daniel left the house shortly after 7:30 in the morning, smiling as he reminded me that he would probably be home late because of another meeting. I wished him a good day, waited until his truck disappeared around the corner, and then returned to the kitchen where my notebook still rested beside the coffee maker. I looked at the list one more time before picking up the telephone and calling Rebecca. She answered immediately, as though she had been expecting my call. We agreed to meet that afternoon at her office, not to discuss confidential financial details, but to help me understand the timeline of the decisions Daniel had been making. Rebecca welcomed me with kindness rather than suspicion. She placed a folder on the conference table but kept it closed, carefully respecting professional boundaries. Instead of showing me documents, she asked me simple questions. When had Daniel first started working late? When had he stopped sharing household plans? When had our conversations begun to change? As we compared dates, a pattern slowly emerged. Nearly every unusual behavior at home had started shortly after he began changing instructions regarding our retirement planning. Rebecca sighed quietly before saying something that stayed with me long after I left her office. Sometimes people hide difficult decisions because they believe they are protecting someone they love. Other times they hide them because they are protecting themselves. The actions can look identical until the truth finally appears. Her words did not answer my questions, but they reminded me that assumptions could still lead me in the wrong direction. Driving home, I realized I no longer wanted to guess. I wanted Daniel to tell me the truth in his own words. That evening I prepared one of his favorite meals, baked lemon herb chicken with roasted vegetables and fresh bread. I set the dining room table carefully, lit 2 small candles and waited. 8 o'clock passed. Then 9. My phone remained silent. I did not call him this time. I simply watched the candles burn lower while listening to the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. At exactly 10:27 the headlights of his truck swept across the front windows. I heard the familiar sound of the garage door opening, followed by slow footsteps entering the kitchen. Daniel looked tired, though not nearly as tired as someone who had supposedly spent the entire evening in meetings. He loosened his tie, smiled gently, and apologized for being late. "Everything is finally coming together," he said with quiet excitement. "I just need a little more time." I looked into his eyes and noticed something different. The confidence that had once made his stories sound effortless now carried the slightest hint of uncertainty. It was almost invisible, but after weeks of careful observation I recognized it immediately. We sat down to eat in comfortable silence. Daniel talked about ordinary things, asking whether the roses near the porch needed trimming, and whether I wanted to visit our daughter next month. I answered each question calmly, never raising my voice, never accusing him of anything. When dinner was over, I carried the dishes into the kitchen and returned holding a simple manila folder. I placed it gently on the dining room table between us. Inside were copies of the missing bank statements, the dates from my notebook, and a handwritten timeline that connected every late night, every unexplained meeting, and every contradiction I had quietly collected over the past several weeks. Daniel looked at the folder but did not open it. The smile slowly disappeared from his face. For the first time in many months, neither of us spoke. We simply looked at each other across the table, both understanding that the evening had reached the point where careful stories would no longer be enough. Daniel stared at the folder for what felt like a full minute before finally reaching for it with both hands. He did not rush. He did not defend himself. He slowly turned each page, reading every date, every bank statement, every handwritten note I had carefully organized over the past several weeks. The room remained completely silent except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. When he reached the final page, he closed the folder and rested his hands on top of it. His shoulders seemed heavier than I had ever seen them. He looked at me with tired eyes and quietly asked, "How long have you known something was wrong?" I answered honestly, "I did not know. I noticed. There is a difference." He lowered his head and nodded slowly. For the first time in months, there was no polished explanation waiting behind his smile. After another long silence, he finally spoke. He admitted that he had hired Rebecca nearly 7 months earlier, because he wanted to surprise me with an early retirement plan that included selling part of his business partnership and purchasing a small lakeside home where we could spend the next chapter of our lives together. He had wanted everything to remain secret until every document was completed. At first, his late meetings had truly been connected to that plan. Then the negotiations began falling apart. His business partner unexpectedly withdrew from the agreement, several financial details changed, and the entire project became uncertain. Embarrassed that the surprise might never happen, Daniel chose to hide each setback instead of telling me the truth. Every new delay forced another excuse. Every excuse required another one after that. Eventually he realized he had become trapped inside his own story, yet he no longer knew how to admit that the dream he had promised himself might never become reality. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I quietly asked the only question that still mattered. "Why did you think disappointment would hurt me more than dishonesty?" Tears gathered in his eyes before he answered. "Because I forgot that you have always been my partner, not my audience." Those words settled over the room with a weight that neither of us could ignore. I believed that he had not been living a secret romantic life. Rebecca had unknowingly confirmed that much. But I also understood that trust is not damaged only by betrayal. It is damaged whenever fear replaces honesty. Daniel reached across the table and took my hand, not expecting forgiveness, only hoping I would not pull away. I did not. I simply held his hand for a long moment before speaking. "If we are going to save this marriage, there can never be another story that I have to uncover on my own." He nodded immediately. "Never again." The weeks that followed were not magically easy. We met with Rebecca together and reviewed every financial decision side by side. We rebuilt our household routines one conversation at a time. Daniel stopped carrying every burden by himself, and I stopped assuming that silence always meant the worst. Looking back now, I no longer remember that long night as the beginning of the end of our marriage. I remember it as the night that forced us to confront something much deeper than missed phone calls or late meetings. Love is not measured by grand surprises or perfect plans. It is measured by the courage to tell the truth before fear has the chance to rewrite it. That lesson did not come easily, but it gave us something far more valuable than the dream we almost chased. It gave us back the partnership we should never have allowed silence to steal.